Okay, you can hear me, huh?
Yes, Dr. Ong, please proceed.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, we must thank Segi University for arranging and organizing this seminar. And particularly, I think we must thank Digital Penang and its CEO, Mr. Tony Yeo, for allowing us to host this on their Zoom account. Now, I shall be talking about the COVID-19 vaccines, the various types and the trials that they have undergone. But before we start, I think it is good to sit back and remind ourselves that COVID is a very new disease, that the data and information we are getting comes fast, changes rapidly. Now, we are supposed to analyze data fairly objectively to reach a conclusion. Unfortunately, many are making the conclusions first and then looking for the data to select out the points that support the conclusion made. This is not how data is supposed to be read. This other thing that adds to the problem is that the information reaches doctors, the media, politicians, and the public all at the same time. Now, these different people will react differently to the data and reach different conclusions. To worsen the problem, some doctors and media act like politicians. Members of the public now are going into media, producing TikTok and YouTube videos and talking like doctors. So we are inundated with data, which is often very confusing. I think it's good to remind ourselves that in fast changing times, we must think, we must analyze things objectively. And so what I shall be doing for the next half hour or so is to remind us how to read medical trials. Good for us doctors and good for members of the public who may be our patients, who may be in other academic areas. How do medical doctors read trials and what do the vaccine trials actually tell us today? Now, this vaccination thing is nothing new. It has been centuries old, and the aim is to essentially give the patient a mild infection so that the patient's own body protects itself against a severe infection. Usually, it involves weakening the source of the infection, as in the example above, taking some pus, heating it to destroy most of the virus and giving it to a healthy person. Sometimes, instead of the diseased patient, secretion is taken from a patient with a similar disease. The classic example is Dr. Bruce Jenner finding that victims of cowpox are protected from the more lethal smallpox. Give them the cowpox infection and they are protected against smallpox. Today, for COVID-19, there are four main groups of vaccines. The first is an inactivated vaccine. This follows the traditional thinking of taking part of the virus, making it weak, and giving it to the patient to protect them from a more severe infection. We also have what we call the protein subunit vaccine, and Novavax that Singapore is thinking of taking is a protein subunit vaccine where only a part of the virus is taken out to be given to the patient. We also have what we call the carrier virus vaccines. In this particular situation, they use not the COVID virus, but another virus, the adenovirus. They then take out the adenovirus parts internally and put in the COVID virus, or they put in an instruction into the adenovirus that will make our body's cells produce parts of the COVID virus. So these are the carrier virus vaccines. And finally, we have the mRNA vaccines, where the patient is given just mRNA, genetic material that will instruct your body to produce parts of the COVID virus. Four main vaccine types. How do I go? Now I have to go forward. Huh? Why can't I go forward? Huh? Oh, my screen hangs, you know. Oh, my screen has hanged, you know. So I need to stop for a while and see why my screen has hanged, you know. There you are. Now, so now when you look at the vaccine types available today, the Pfizer or BNT vaccine, which actually is produced by the German company BNT, licensed to Pfizer around the world, but in Greater China, licensed to Fosun. This is an mRNA vaccine where they just give the genetic material to the patient. The main point with this vaccine is that it needs cold storage. The Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines are inactivated vaccines, and this uses an old, well-documented technology that has been proven to be safe for many years. The AstraZeneca is a viral vector vaccine. When they take another virus, in this case, a chimpanzee adenovirus, they change the coding inside, and they will then make the body produce your own COVID part. The problem with AstraZeneca is that it has gone into some controversy, and there are a lot of government regulations that differ around the world, such as it cannot be used in the young age group, while some countries don't use it at all. In Malaysia, the government has intelligently taken Astra out of the country's vaccination program to an opt-in program. So if you want, you get Astra, and if you don't, you wait longer for the government's program. CanSino is the next one that the government says they'll be getting. It is also a viral vector vaccine, but a different viral vector from Astra's. And the point useful about it is that it is a single dose vaccine. CanSino and J&J are single dose vaccine, and many people do not turn up for the second dose. In US, the number not turning up for the second dose has run to the millions. So if you use a single dose vaccine, at least you have covered them adequately. And there are many, many other vaccines in production around the world. Malaysia and Singapore and Thailand both are working on their indigenous vaccine. In China, for example, they have approved 7 with 71 under investigation. So there is a lot of vaccines in the market. Now, the thing about the vaccines, the trials show clearly is that they work. This is the Pfizer BNT vaccine. If you don't take the vaccine, the chances of getting the COVID virus goes up. If you take it, it is depressed dramatically. The efficacy, they say, is 95%. 8 COVID cases amongst the vaccinated group, 162 COVID cases in the unvaccinated group, a very high degree of efficacy. It is the same with the AstraZeneca. Much lower incidence of infection if you take the vaccine. And this is again replicated in the Sputnik, the Russian vaccine. Much lower incidence of COVID protection if you take the vaccine. And this paper is published in the Lancet, well-established journal, so fairly rigorous trial on Sputnik. What about side effects? This is the BNT vaccine again, and you can see that for local side effects, it's actually quite a lot. 80% will have some form of pain at the injection site. Less people will get redness or swelling, but pain is fairly common. And if you talk of systemic side effects, fatigue occurs in about 50% of the people, headache in about 40%, and muscle pain around the body in about 30%. So the incidence of side effects is actually not low, but the side effects are of short duration. So there will be some side effects post-vaccination. And as you can see again, second dose tends to be higher than the first dose. So if first dose goes well for you, good. But for the second dose, you must rest more, be prepared more, because the side effects can be more for the second dose. Now, these results shows that the vaccine is good overall. This is the Pfizer vaccine, and it is good across countries, across racial, sexual groups, and across age groups. So the trials have successfully answered the question they were designed for, which is during this COVID pandemic, the vaccines can safely reduce attacks of symptomatic disease. That means you won't catch COVID and feel it. That is the way the trials are designed. They are safe to use. You won't feel the COVID during this period. And we are in a COVID pandemic, so I think it is very clear we must get ourselves vaccinated. But having said that, there is much that we don't know and many questions that are unanswered. Now, saying that there are things we don't know and question unanswered is not the same as admitting that we are hiding data, covering up mistakes, or worse still, telling lies. We must admit that we don't know and we have questions before we can learn the answer and before we can obtain knowledge. Unfortunately, there is too much accusation of hidden agenda going all over the place. And so to this university seminar and intellectual audience, I think I would like to point out that there are weaknesses in all the vaccine trials. For most of the trials, there are no Asian centers. They are very, very short in duration. They only produce a small number of COVID cases. Now, it is okay to have tens of thousands of participants, but the actual number of COVID cases that you uncover are very small, less than 200 in most trials. The methodology of the trials were not good, especially in definition of disease, in the doses given, and even in the intervals between the doses. There is no information on what happens to subgroup of patients like those with hypertension, diabetes, heart disease. And you know that the COVID patient with hypertension or diabetes will be different. So it's very important to know what happens to hypertensive COVID patients, diabetic COVID patients. How do the vaccines work? And we have no answer. None of the trials systematically looked for the asymptomatic case. A large proportion of COVID patients are asymptomatic. Do the vaccines protect such types of COVID disease? We do not know. And then finally, there's the question of variants nowadays, and we do not know the effectiveness of the vaccine against the variants. Therefore, all the vaccines that have been approved are approved for emergency use. And that is a point worth noting. They are actually not approved for general use. But this is an emergency COVID-19 pandemic. So they have been approved, rightly so, and so we must get ourselves vaccinated. Now, I would like to put this point that we have to get vaccinated on every slide, especially when I criticize the trial, so that I'm not taken to be an anti-vaxxer and get into trouble again. Okay, I think it is good to remind ourselves what are good medical trials. So as we compare the vaccine trials, let us compare them with the previous heart or hypertensive trials, and two outstanding ones were the HOPE trial and the trial. The HOPE trial posed a simple question. Does giving this drug, ramipril, which is an ACE inhibitor, does giving this drug to high-risk patients reduce their heart disease later on? This trial ran for 5 years. It studied 10,000 patients, but more important than the patients, there were 1,500 bad outcomes in the patients. That means they successfully found 1,477 with the endpoint they wanted to look at, which is cardiovascular death or non-fatal heart attack or stroke. In the all-HAD trial, the question posed is, was one type of blood pressure lowering drug better than another type in protecting the heart? And again, this trial ran for 4.9 years. A lot of participants, and finally they got about 3,000 events. So they found 3,000 patients who either had a fatal heart disease or non-fatal heart attack. So this trial ran for a long time, had thousands of adverse events to produce the result. Now, this is the baseline characteristic. This is the baseline characteristic. Sorry, let me see, I can't. This is the baseline characteristic of the Pfizer trial. And as you can see, there were only about 4% Asians in the recruited group. Very small Asian numbers, and none of the centers was in Asia, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, or the United States. Look at the presentation of the baseline data here. Oh, hang again. Huh? Okay. This is a chart on what makes different phases of clinical trials. Before a drug is approved, it goes through phase 1, phase 2, and then phase 3 clinical trials. And most phase 3 clinical trials should run for several years, and you must have good randomization. That means that the groups you study, both that received the treatment and without the treatment, were the same. Must be double blind. That means you do not know who is getting what, so as to eliminate all bias. Now, look at the Pfizer trial. The Pfizer trial ran for 2 months. Look at the Astra trial. First dose after first dose was 3.4 months, and after 2 doses was 2 months. So compared to the advised several years for a phase 3 clinical trial, the 2 trials were obviously of very short duration. Now, look at the number of cases of COVID uncovered. In the Pfizer trial, it was 170 COVID cases, 8 in the vaccinated group, 162 in the unvaccinated group. At the time the trial ran, which was in December 2020, there were over 200,000 cases of COVID a day in the United States. These 170 COVID cases actually make up 1.2 minutes of the US daily experience. So essentially, we are getting just 1.2-minute glimpse of the COVID pandemic in America to produce this result for which we are now basing so much importance. In the case of AstraZeneca, they produced only 131 cases of COVID, 30 in the vaccinated group, 101 in the control group. And at that time in the United Kingdom, they had about 50-odd thousand, 60,000 cases a day. So we are essentially looking at 3 minutes of the daily UK experience then. So you can see that the trials were actually very small trials. Now, before we talk further about the vaccine, we must understand the clinical cause of COVID. This is how disease generally comes about. There will be an incubation period where the patient doesn't feel unwell. And then during the disease period, the patients feel unwell, develop symptoms for the disease. The period where the disease can communicate, spread to other people, involves a part of the incubation period where the patient is well, and usually throughout the time when the patient is unwell until shortly afterwards. This is the normal disease. In COVID, it is more difficult because throughout the course of the disease, the patient can be asymptomatic, totally well, and some can be mildly sick, some are moderately sick, and some are severely sick. So the problem with COVID is that the presentation, the cause, and the outcome is very variable and unpredictable. 20 to 30% of them are asymptomatic, meaning that they have no disease. Mild in 70%, severe in 5%, and others end up with long COVID. That means feeling unwell for months afterwards. And we also know that whether patients are old, fat, have hypertension, diabetes, heart, kidney, lung, neurological, or malignant disease, all these factors affect the outcome of COVID in a particular person, meaning that these groups of patients react differently when they catch COVID. So after vaccination, we have to wonder, is the prevention for asymptomatic, mild, severe COVID, are they the same or are they different? Is the protection in the elderly, in the obese, in the hypertensive, diabetic, and those with different types of organ damage, are the protection different? We therefore need very good randomized trials. We have to ensure that the groups that in the two arms, the vaccinated group and the placebo group, the two groups we are comparing are similar in these characteristics so as to eliminate bias. Now, you look at the report, the baseline characteristics reported for the Pfizer trial, and you can see none of these features are given except for two large age groups. And compare that with this, the baseline characteristic for the HOPE trial. Look, they not only present the incidence of heart disease, they divide up to various categories of heart disease. Heart attack within 1 year, after 1 year, angina, unstable angina. Look, all these very, very well equated in the two groups, treated group and placebo group, for heart disease, for stroke, for peripheral vascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, whether they smoke, and what sort of medicine they are. Very well balanced at baseline, the two groups. Not in the case for the vaccine trials. See, HOPE trial, very good baseline equivalence. And this is the ALL-HAD trial, the other good trial I spoke about. Not just whether they had high blood pressure, but they showed that the blood pressure was equivalent in all the three groups of patients studied because they compared three types of antihypertensive drugs, whether they smoked cigarette, and again, the type of heart disease they had was very well distinguished and very well demarcated, whether they were diabetic, what their cholesterol levels were, and whether they had heart thickening, left ventricular hypertrophy by various means. Look at the figures, all very equally matched in the three groups. Again, this we do not see in the vaccine trials. Look at the report of the results. This is, again, the report of the Pfizer trial. You do not know whether hypertensive patients are different, diabetic patients react differently to the vaccine, patients with heart disease, with stroke, nothing mentioned in the result. Look at the report from the HOPE trial. See whether patients had cardiovascular disease or not. They demarcated it: diabetes, hypertension, coronary heart disease, prior heart attack, cerebrovascular disease, peripheral vascular disease. They showed very good subgroup analysis of the trial. So not good baseline characteristic, not good subgroup reports. Now, what about the asymptomatic patient? I can't get rid of this. So they are not designed to look at the asymptomatic COVID. The definition in the Pfizer trial, you must have symptoms and you must be tested during the symptomatic patient. So if you do not have symptoms, or if you visit them after the symptomatic period, you will not be tested. Look at for the AstraZeneca trial, again, the qualifying symptoms and in the UK and Brazil were the following. The qualifying symptoms in South Africa were broader, and in UK, some were tested for asymptomatic infection. So in essence, the trial was not designed to look at asymptomatic COVID, which we are now finding because we are testing the workers, and like in the case of Singapore, the foreign workers in the dormitories, a large majority of them are asymptomatic. So how the vaccines work on asymptomatic transmission, we actually do not know. Now, the methodology of the trials were no good. The methodologies differed in different areas, and the difference, they were not designed to assess different severity of COVID. Look at the AstraZeneca trial. It was inconsistent across the three countries where it was carried out. In the UK, Brazil, and South Africa, they had different definition for entry criteria. In UK and Brazil, such were the qualifying symptoms. In South Africa, it was broader. In UK, they included asymptomatic people. In the Pfizer trial, because of their definition of what comprised COVID, they had many patients that were suspected but unconfirmed. They produced 170 COVID cases, but many more were classified as suspected but unconfirmed cases. And I shall talk about them later. Now, the doses given in the trials were different for Astra. The intervals between doses can even be different, and they mixed up the doses. Now, under ordinary times, when people do a study like that, the study will be rejected. But these are not ordinary times. See, for the AstraZeneca trial, these are all obtained from the journal articles. Read the articles, and these are word for word copied from the journal articles. In the United Kingdom, they had two dosage groups. One group had low dose followed by standard dose, and another group had two standard dose. In Brazil, they had two standard dose, but they were given up to 12 weeks apart. The target is to give for 4 weeks. They cannot even standardize the interval between the doses when conducting a trial. And in South Africa, there was a mixed up because a small group had half dose followed by a full dose, or the full dose followed by a half dose. So the methodology for the trial really was not robust and not good. Having talked about the Pfizer's trial weakness, the AstraZeneca trial weakness, we now come to Sinovac. Now, Sinovac has been approved in 22 countries with trials conducted in 3. Media reports from Turkey says it's effective, from Indonesia says it's effective, but remember, these are not journal reports, these are reports in the press, and in use, again, reports in the press that is 95 to 98% effective against death and hospitalization. Uruguay says it's good, again, in use. And this is an interesting report from the town of Serrana in Brazil. They started a project called Project S, where they vaccinated almost the entire population of the town, 27,000 over a 3-month period. And by June the 1st, they reported that the town, compared to the rest of Brazil that was having a bad COVID attack, saw a 95% reduction in death, 86% hospitalization, and 80% of those who complained of COVID symptoms. So a newspaper report, but fairly interesting because the whole town was vaccinated and the town became much better than the rest of Brazil. Now let us look at the Brazilian trial that was often quoted to say I don't know how to get rid of it. I hope this is not blocking. This is the Brazilian trial that's often quoted to say that it is 50.4% effective for Sinovac. Till today, it remains unpublished. It is actually a trial in a healthcare institution, almost 10,000 healthcare people. They were seen for 14 days, very short trial, 2 weeks afterwards, and there were 250 cases of COVID. So in terms of COVID numbers, it was reasonable, but certainly very short duration trial. The trial is not well done at all. The definitions used was not clear, and the results produced confidence interval that was wide and inconsistent. Now, when a result is produced, we not only look at the result, we look at the 95% confidence interval. The 95% confidence interval tells us how sure we are to an accuracy of 95% that the actual result falls in between. If your 95% confidence interval is narrow, it means the result is very believable. The wider your 95% confidence interval, the less confidence you have in the result. So the results from this Brazilian trial is very wide confidence intervals. Look at how they define their disease when they talk about wanting the disease. Too many subgroups, and in the final report, they reported for mild, moderate, and severe. So again, there's a lot of confusion how you arrive from one definition to another. Essentially, it shows that for mild COVID, it's not so good. For moderate COVID, yes. And for severe COVID, all the vaccinated people did not have severe COVID. But look at the confidence interval, very wide. And look at this, you have confidence interval 56 to 100, and your figure that you give is 100. Normally, the figure efficacy falls somewhere in between the 95% confidence interval. So a lot of questions to this trial, which today is only in preprint, which means that it didn't pass the reviewer analysis and so could not be published. But this paper brought up an important point. For the first time, it suggests that the vaccine is actually good in preventing severe COVID and death, but the vaccine is weaker in preventing mild disease. Now, this is an important point, and I think we should now ask ourselves, does the Pfizer result show that? Does the Astra trial show that? Up to yesterday, I would have said the evidence for Sinovac is very weak, no good. But then yesterday, a journal paper came out in the Lancet. Look at the date. Journal paper came out in Lancet from Turkey. And it is again similar to the Astra or the Pfizer trials. Vaccinated much less than the unvaccinated group, very safe. The incidence of side effects of the vaccinated group compared to the placebo group, hardly any difference. So a vaccine efficacy of about 84%, limited side effects for Sinovac. So if the Health Science Authority in Singapore is looking for evidence for Sinovac, you can always tell them, read the Lancet paper on the 8th of July and they will see the evidence there. So I think it is safe to say that the Sinovac, the Pfizer, and the Astra trials were not strong. Don't just take my word for it. In December 2020, when the FDA expert committee sat down to assess the Pfizer data, approval was given for emergency licensing, but not unanimously. The vote was 17 for approval, 4 against approval, which means that 20% of American experts during a pandemic that killed 1,000 people a day, that produced 200,000 over cases a day, felt that more information was needed and the Pfizer vaccine could not be approved. 20% of American experts. And as for the AstraZeneca vaccine, till today, the FDA has not approved it. Despite the special relationship between the US and UK, the FDA has not approved the Astra vaccine. So to say that the Pfizer AstraZeneca trials are not robust trials, I think is not wrong scientifically, but we must remember that is very, very different from saying don't get vaccinated. The trials have produced the answer to the question that was asked. During a pandemic, can the vaccine protect against COVID? The answer is yes. We are in a pandemic, so we must get ourselves vaccinated. Now, this is a question people often ask. Which vaccine is better? Don't ask which vaccine is better because there is no trial designed to answer that question, and perhaps there never will be. When we ask the question, which antihypertensive drug is better, we have trials that are designed to answer that question. In this all-HAD trial, you compare chlorothalidone to amlodipine to lisinopril, and you look at the outcome, the primary outcome, the secondary outcome of death, combined heart disease, stroke, renal disease, cancer, bleeding. You have a trial that accurately compared three types of antihypertensive drugs. There were 33,000 patients, almost 3,000 events, and the follow-up was 5 years. Now, can you imagine doing a trial of trying to get 3,000 COVID cases? Can you imagine a COVID trial lasting years till the pandemic is over? So we have not done and probably will never do a trial comparing the effects of the various vaccines. So don't ask the question, which vaccine is better? Rather, it is more important to look at consistent message from the trials. We have had 3 major trials done on 3 big vaccines. Is there any consistent message that they are giving us? Because the Sinovac trial has suggested that the vaccine is good at preventing severe COVID and death, and it is weaker at preventing milder disease. What about Pfizer? What about AstraZeneca? Is that true for the two? And is that true for all the vaccines? So it is always very important to look for consistency in any medical trials. Now, in the Pfizer trial, again, as I said, there are 170 COVID cases, but there were 3,400 suspected and unconfirmed COVID. There are 20 times more suspected cases than confirmed cases. 170 confirmed, but 3,400 suspected. Now, when you just look at the confirmed COVID cases, yes, the efficacy is 95%, but if you add the suspected to the confirmed, the efficacy drops to 15%. And if you exclude cases that come about within 7 days of vaccination, but still add the suspected and confirmed together, you get 29% efficacy. So this seems to point out that when you talk about the more severe COVID, those that are positive and tested because they qualify feeling the symptoms enough to get themselves tested, it is very effective, 95%. But when you talk about milder COVID, because they were reported as suspected, but they didn't qualify for testing, then the Pfizer vaccine is not at all very effective, 19 to 29%. Now, this comes from Peter Doshi, who is an associate editor at the British Medical Journal, who went through 400 pages of data from the Pfizer trial to come out with these results. And if you go into the website, you can still see his report there, and he produces his calculation for 19 and 25%. So again, there seems to be this suggestion from the Pfizer trial in their 400 pages, which was not in the journal, that it is very effective. It is very effective, but only against the severe COVID, that it is not so effective against milder COVID. And what you have on the 5th of July was a report from the Israel Health Ministry that the vaccine effectiveness is now 64%. When it was first introduced, the figure was produced that the vaccine effectiveness was 90 to 5%, but now they say it is 64% effective, although it is still 93% effective against hospitalization and severe illness. So again, practical data from Israel suggesting that in actual fact, the vaccine is less effective at milder forms of COVID, but still very good against severe COVID. What about AstraZeneca? Now, the actual report from AstraZeneca is actually that there were 30 COVID cases in the vaccinated group and 100 COVID cases in the control group, and the efficacy is 70%. This is how it is reported. And they then went on to say that in the subgroup, that received low dose followed by the standard dose, in the subgroup that received a low dose followed by the standard dose, the efficacy is 90%. In the subgroup that received 2 standard dose, the efficacy is 62%. Now, anyone reading this data has to stop. When you give low dose followed by full dose, it's 90% effective. You give 2 full doses, the effectiveness dropped to 62%. Now, what has happened? How can this make sense? But it does make sense because, oh dear, my thing hangs again. Oh dear, but it does make sense because in the low dose standard dose group, they were looking at symptomatic COVID. All the patients that were in the low dose standard dose group had symptoms of COVID. When you, amongst the patients who had 2 standard doses, 2 full doses, some of them had asymptomatic COVID. They were looking also at asymptomatic COVID. So when you start looking for asymptomatic and mild COVID, the vaccine effect drops. When you just look at severe symptomatic COVID, the vaccine is very effective. Again, the same thing that you saw in Sinovac. When they look for mild disease, the efficacy drops to 50%. The same thing you see in Pfizer. When you consider the suspected cases, the efficacy drops to 30%, So every single vaccine seems to show that when you look for the asymptomatic case, the effectiveness is less. When you look for the symptomatic COVID, the ability of the vaccine to protect against severe COVID that you can feel, the vaccine is very effective. So again, AstraZeneca looks good at preventing symptomatic COVID, but is weaker against the asymptomatic or milder COVID. So besides just the trial results, you see, the trials were published and done over a short period around the end of last year, but we are now in July 2021. We now have about 7 months experience with the vaccine, a far longer experience now than the trial duration, which was just for 2 to 3 months. What is the effect of COVID vaccines around the world? Let us look at practical real-world reports, and let us look at the trend for COVID cases or death as shown in the WHO website. Now, this is a report just out 3 days ago. This talk is very hard to give because in the last 3 days, 2 major papers came out on Sinovac. One in the New England Journal and the other in the Lancet. So as I was telling Patrick, very stressful giving this talk. Every day must search to see if new papers have come out. So if you look at this report, which is from Chile, which is a practical example, you look at it, the fully immunized group had 64% effect against catching COVID, but 86% against hospitalization, 90% against ICU admission, and 87% against death. And to summarize the results, that the population of Chile was vaccinated over 3 months. They looked at 10.2 million residents of Chile and look at the number of COVID cases. It's not hundreds as in the trials, it's hundreds of thousands of COVID cases, tens of thousands of hospitalization, thousands of ICU admissions and death. And they found that it is about 66% effective Sinovac for the prevention of COVID-19, 88% prevention of hospitalization, 90% against ICU admission, 86% against death. Now, I would suspect that for Astra, for Pfizer, it cannot be very different. Not so good at preventing COVID, especially mild or asymptomatic COVID, but the more severe the COVID, the more they seem to be able to prevent it. So good at preventing severe COVID and death, weaker for the mild disease. Okay, now let us look at the United Kingdom. This is a country with a population of 66 million using AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna. Look at the trend for cases, down and then up again. This is July the 2nd. Yesterday, it's gone to 35,000 cases. So the cases are going up. So why are the cases going up? They say it's because of opening up, because of variants. But nobody says it is because vaccines ineffective. Meanwhile, you read about Seychelles, Indonesia, Sinovac is ineffective, but nobody says Astra, Pfizer, Moderna, very ineffective. That's why UK going up. So one has to distinguish this reading of data and making it fit previously made conclusions instead of looking at data to make conclusions. But look at the deaths, very low deaths. So cases go up, very low deaths. Perhaps as the studies have shown, the vaccine is preventing severe illness. But there's another possibility. It could be that the new variants, while easier to spread, are actually producing milder disease. They don't kill so much because the virus actually doesn't want to kill us. The virus wants to spread. So it will make us sick so that we can spread the disease. But if they kill us off, they will also die, you know. So perhaps variants have become weaker in producing severe disease, or is it because it's still early in the wave? You see, the cases will go up first and the deaths will follow later. We do not know the answer to the question, why are the deaths still low? And we must say that the UK is trying out a very interesting experiment. Can society open up after vaccination and withstand the COVID wave? And there's a lot of debate going around there between medical experts in the UK. Should society open up and let the NHS face the COVID cases? Look at South Africa. See, South Africa, 58 million, vaccination rate low. Look, cases are up. What did they use? They used Pfizer, they used J&J. Cases up, and look at it, deaths are up. Now, why? Is it because Pfizer and J&J no good? No, it is because they had a lot of problems with vaccine delivery and vaccination. You know, Pfizer needs cold storage, and perhaps they couldn't store it. J&J was, they couldn't deliver the stocks. South Africa is not a rich country, and most of these companies have sold their drugs to the developed world, and so they were slow in delivering to South Africa that then cannot vaccinate for a population. For a population of 58 million, they have only vaccinated 2 million. And so what did they do? They urgently approved Sinovac so that they could get supply, their hands onto vaccine to vaccinate the country fast. So don't ask which vaccine is better. And some may say, which makes better profit for me or which makes better image for me, but ask which vaccine you can give quickly and successfully. I show you two examples of European countries, one Serbia, one Hungary. Both Serbia, about 7 million, vaccination rate very high, good lockdown by the government. Cases went from about 8,000 a day to now 80 a day. Death went from about 60 a day now to 4 per day. What do they use? Sinopharm, Sputnik, and Pfizer. Looks like whether west or east or north, what the government can get their hands on, they use. Look at Hungary, population 10 million. Look at it, from 10,000 cases to 0 cases. Death from 300 now to 0. And what do they use? Sinopharm, Sputnik, Pfizer, Moderna. So it looks like whatever vaccine you can get your hands on, use it. Use it as best you can, as quickly you can, without prejudice to China, Russia, America, or anywhere else. And then, of course, look at Israel. See, population 8.5 million, very high vaccination with Pfizer and Moderna. Cases down very successfully to 0. and now up again. It's now in the hundreds. On the 5th, they had about 500, subsequently about 300 odd. So cases up, successfully pushed down, but now coming up again. Why? Because society is opening up. When society opens up, despite your very good vaccination rates, whatever vaccine you use, cases will go up. And on the 5th of July, they said that the efficacy of the vaccine has dropped. Now, when you lock down, cases drop. You vaccinate at the same time, and then you will attribute the drop in cases to the wonderful vaccine you have used. Actually, it is a combination of vaccination and lockdown. And so now when they open up, they find cases going up. And so mathematically calculating, the vaccine appears to be less successful. I think it is important to realize that lockdown or opening will change the incidence of COVID, that variants will affect the number of cases, and vaccines can only be part of the equation. It is very important to get the right lesson from the data so that we know how to protect ourselves. If we are prejudiced, if we make wrong conclusions, then we will be the ones to suffer. There is a problem with media, vaccines, and marketing. Now, look at this. These are all news from yesterday or a week ago. Pfizer seeks US authorization for booster dose. No one says it's because Pfizer is ineffective. When Sinovac talks about this, it is because Chinese vaccines are ineffective. No one says that Pfizer is short acting. When the trial is run to mix Pfizer and Astra vaccines together to see whether it is better than one vaccine alone, nobody says it is because the vaccines are weak. It's reported as mixing vaccines provides good protection. Nobody suggests it is weak. At a virology conference in China, when somebody suggested that that's what they're going to try, it is written and headlined as Chinese specialists admits Sinovac no good, you know. This is the report on Bloomberg about the Chilean paper, the 10 million man study that found Sinovac to be 80-90% effective against hospitalization, ICU. The thing is that Sinovac vaccine is found to be inferior to Pfizer shot in Chile study. Now, the Chile study only looks at Sinovac. I read through the paper. Chile also uses Pfizer, but in very small numbers. So the author said they are not considering the Pfizer group because it is used in too small a group. So from a study of Sinovac, they are able to conclude that Sinovac is inferior to Pfizer when no such comparison is made in the study. So this is the problem with the press, that the press comes out with headlines with a message that is not what actually the study addresses. And the problem is that meanwhile, when that happens, we have lost the most important message of the trial. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the Singapore government rightly says that COVID will be endemic, and so we must treat it like a flu. So if you treat COVID like a flu, perhaps we can look at flu vaccination. Now, how successful are the flu vaccination? The CDC says the flu vaccines are 40 to 60% effective. If the flu vaccines that have been researched for so long are only 40 to 60% effective, how can your vaccine be 95% effective across all types of disease and good for all types of variants? And look, it is during different seasons. CDC says that when a different season comes along, the flu vaccine's effectiveness will change and the type of vaccine given will change. So we are likely to need annual boosters like for the flu. And it is likely that we will need different vaccines for different strains in different years. So don't ask which vaccine is good. Which vaccine is good for this period in time. And for this period in time, it looks like all vaccines will work. So please take the vaccines. We don't know next year. Pfizer just yesterday asked for a booster dose, but I think CDC says there's too many unused Pfizer vaccines left. We will not approve it for the time being. That was a joke. The FDA will not approve the application for booster as yet. Now, in Singapore, they have recently come up with the data on adverse effects. that over the period that they have given, the adverse effects are very low. 120 per 100,000 doses, serious adverse effects 4.6 per 100,000 doses. Adverse effects very low. Amongst the young, it is about similar to the old, and you now worry about specific side effects. Now, you worry about the inflammation of the heart induced by the mRNA vaccine, myocarditis, pericarditis. Overall, very low, but in young men, incidence is higher, 1.24 per 100,000. Still low, but higher than in the general population. For AstraZeneca, there is a worry about this syndrome of low platelet and blood clot. It is also very low. In the elderly group, it's 1 per 100,000, but for the younger group, 2 per 100,000. So it is still very low. But look at this report. This report comes from Euro surveillance, and they say if you vaccinate the entire population of France, in the young people who receive AstraZeneca vaccine, you would have prevented 10 COVID deaths, but you would have caused 21 deaths from blood clot. So while the side effects are true low, they can cause significant harm to those in the high risk group. So one has to be careful, and I think constantly reassess the data and think about implementation before doing the vaccines. The adverse effects are very rare. The benefits certainly outweigh the risk, but we must protect the vulnerable group. The vulnerable group for COVID, we protect against COVID. The vulnerable group for side effects, we have to protect against the side effects. So, ladies and gentlemen, the vaccines are very protective against severe disease. They are less protective against mild or asymptomatic COVID. That cases will go down with lockdown, but they will come up with opening. And the reason why Malaysia is not quite successful with our latest lockdown is because we are trying, again, experiment, lockdown and opening at the same time. Every government tries something because no one has the answer. And so lockdown cases will go down, opening cases will come out. That it is very important. We must have masking, we must maintain sanitation, SOPs to keep the cases down. And this means that after vaccination, we have to maintain SOP. We cannot say we have had a vaccine and we'll be 95% protected against everything. No, we get ourselves vaccinated, but we maintain masking, maintain SOPs so that cases go down. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in an emergency COVID pandemic. There is much that we do not know. We must admit it so that we can learn. At this stage, it appears that all vaccines are similar. We have to get vaccinated. It appears that all are fairly safe. They've been approved by WHO and they prevent severe COVID. They might be less effective against mild COVID and against variant COVID. Learning from the example of the flu, if it's a different season, the old vaccine will be less effective, although still mildly protective. We must always maintain SOPs. And these days, it is very difficult. There's a lot of politics, there's a lot of marketing, and we have to distinguish this from science. Nevertheless, we are in a COVID pandemic. We must get vaccinated. And with that, I thank you very much.